Kenally has just published a new novel, Towards Asmara, a book about the politics of famine, and its setting is the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Don Featherson's South Bank Show film follows Kenally as he retraces the journey he made when he researched the novel 2 years ago and encounters again the people and events that he turned into fiction. It's a journey that begins at the highland stronghold of the Eritreans and ends in the trenches at the front line within sight of the Ethiopian guns.
The novel's set amongst the Eritrean people, and they've been struggling for 27 years on an enormous scale, an enormous war. They've been fighting to regain freedoms which Haile Selassie abolished when he took away their language, their flag, and when he forced them to become part of Ethiopia. I researched this novel during a journey to Eritrea 2 years ago. Although I swore I'd never come back, because you have to cross this awesome stretch of the Sudan to get there, I am going back because I was captivated by the Eritrean people. Now, since I was there, a lot of changes have occurred. I want to go back to re-verify what I found out on that first trip. And of course I want to revisit some of the scenes I saw with my wife Judy.
When he came back to Australia, he said he'd visited the most remarkable society on earth. And that society really did hijack the book. I then became involved in the research, and of course I read all the manuscripts. And at the conclusion of that, I felt that, while I'm not saying Tom's given to exaggeration, I really felt I had to come and have a look for myself.
There was no single road, only a set of alternative tracks, a series of sandy, treacherous options. Along them that afternoon, as apparently on all other afternoons, the Eritrean trucks ploughed, travelling empty up to Port Sudan to collect aid consigned to them, however much against the wish of Addis, and returning south, laden. Supposedly, if you'd crawled over the back of these trucks, you would have found sorghum and wheat, Oxfam high-protein biscuits, water pump replacements, canisters of raw pharmaceuticals, stacks of plastic bags to be filled with Eritrea's own surgical drips in deep, sterile caves. All afternoon we encountered these Mercedes trucks, green painted, each of them with a number on its flanks. The number the last thing we saw before we raised our shawls over our mouths or clamped our hats or bandanas there against the world of dust. I couldn't avoid being touched and excited by all this afternoon traffic.
I'd always been interested in the way we in the West like to think of great famines and of the sort of chronic hunger, the daily hunger of people in these regions as an act of God. We'd rather believe it was a drought because then we don't have to do anything about the politics. I wanted to write a book that looked at that question. Is it an act of God, this endemic hunger, or is it an act of politics? The Eritreans have made a few mistakes in their 27 years, and one was attacking an aid convoy in 1987. And I remember seeing Bob Geldof very nearly reduced to tears by this event on television. And so I thought that if you could get the central character, a man named Darcy, to go to Africa, to go to Eritrea, to investigate this aid convoy attack, you could explain through his observations the entire business of the politics of hunger. Darcy's journey into the war zone itself starts at Arota, which is a city made out of necessity by the Eritreans when they retreated deep into the mountains in front of the Ethiopian advance. Everything in Arota's either underground or camouflaged. Even the accommodation for foreign journalists has its own gun emplacement manned by soldiers of the EPLF, Eritrean People's Liberation Front. It was in this guest house 2 years ago that I met my guide for that first trip.
It's how are you? Camilla, oh hi. So nice.
How are you?
Not bad. You've got married.
Yeah, I got married.
To a girl with an AK-47. Here we go.
We've heard so much about you
The Eritreans carry all your luggage from here on.
Oh, that's wonderful.
You can't stop.
Thank you.
Listen, Professor Hart, let's see this wife of yours. Oh, that's beautiful. The best looking women in the world, apart from Judy.
Diplomatic. Thank you. Your eyes. Just so beautiful.
Look, Professor Hart, I've got a confession to make to you. There's a character like you in the novel, so I hope you won't take a libel writ against me. He's a guide like you, but I fictionalized him. I made him skinny. He's a veteran like you, lots of wounds all over his body. He likes drinking Sewer, the Eritrean beer. And he's called Mocha.
Mocha.
And I believe there is a skinny veteran called Mocha, so you can't win. But in any case, he's in there. I changed me too. I made the central character, the man who's telling the story. He's Australian, but he's much younger, and he's much handsomer than I am. So and he's also skinnier than I am. Professor Hart isn't available for this trip, so Goitom, who's another member of the protocol department, will be our guide this time. The hidden city of Eritrea, far from the front line, is a relatively safe place for the sick, the malnourished, the wounded to be treated.
It was a hospital of night. As we lay all day under the guest house trellis, the doctors and the sick of Eritrea sheltered until the generators came on at dark, in bunkers and under foliage in the hospital valley nearby. Outside, in the last of the light, the jagged flanks of hills seemed to weigh down and deny a place to science. I wondered, was it possible? Literal surgery in a place like this, a place made out of the rudiments of earth and fire.
About 50% of the injuries are from landmines, and of course you see the amputees all round Eritrea, and the other 50% are due to shelling and bombing, and there are some napalm victims as well. So that's what happens on the side of the war, and on the side of the famine. Of course, the major cause of death and illness is malnourishment.
We were led into a long tent supported by hewn logs. Here some 30 women lay on camp cots. They wore dusty but colourful sheaths of cloth.
Well, the doctors round here say that there's a big decline in the severely malnourished category. But of course there are still lots of tragically malnourished women in this ward and in every ward in Eritrea. And that they're not more numerous in number is due entirely to two factors. One is Western aid and the other is Eritrean cleverness. But they won't be assured of health until this terrible war is settled and they themselves can become settled.
By dawn, when we had visited every bunker, every ward, I felt invigorated. I was disarmed by the cunning, by the competence, by all the crafts socketed away in these mountains of shale, in these secret and kindly caves the MiGs and the Antonovs couldn't find.
Because of the air raids by the Ethiopian MiGs, in fact because of the war in general, you find whole villages and tribes have been driven off their traditional ground and have been relocated here in the mountains. The people live in camouflage bunkers and their children learn in camouflage schools. Food supply is always tenuous.
Shaven-headed children in dust-laden gowns straggled past us on their way to school in some cave. Their transience was just about palpable. You could taste it on the tongue in this high, dry country where a delay in rain or an upgrading of an Ethiopian offensive could cancel them. It was nearly beyond bearing to think of them learning their maths in holes in the earth or behind the negligible walls of scrub shelters. 7/8 is greater than 3/4. True or false? Training in a pocket of dust for the computer age. Language for a future of commerce with the West. The hard and fast curriculum of the Eritreans. Even the children with the swollen and misshapen skulls, even those who could not credibly expect to see 20, even those whom one delay of rain or one small enteric fever could be expected to do for, even they were made to sit in class.
The Center for Food Distribution for the whole of Eritrea is at Himbol. The character Darcy travels to this unutterably hot town and beholds there the distribution of Western aid. The Eritreans are generally in quite good health in Eritrean terms, but not in Western terms, compared to the level of health, say, 2 years ago, certainly 5 years ago. Now, this is a credit to the efficiency of ERA, the Eritrean Relief Association, which the Eritreans run themselves, and of course it's a credit to all the nations that send this aid. The very fact that these people need aid when they've been self-sufficient for so long, the very fact that it's undercover, that it has to be undercover to avoid the MiGs, is an indication of the impact of the war on these people. And any upgrading of A, drought, or B, war, would of course affect them drastically. They've been subjected to aerial bombardment. It's changed their way of life. For example, they've had to come into the trees away from the open country, and it's in the trees that they encounter the malarial mosquitoes. They can't plant in peace, they can't reap in peace, they can't reforestate, and their entire way of life has been altered by this conflict. And therefore, until the conflict ends, they can't be self-sufficient. The great moral dilemma in writing about this region at all is that you have to talk about the way some organizations use aid properly and some nations don't. And one fears that this will have the effect of making people give, as every visitor does, the situation, the high color, the acute misery and the heroism of the Eritreans. And I attempted to put all this into the novel, and it was hard to reduce down. It was hard to give it a focus. So at the first, the book was too documentary, and I wanted it to be fiction. I wanted it to have the lineaments of fiction, and so it took a number of drafts before the characters took over. Because in a novel, you can't say anything of worth unless the novel is good technically. May I be blasphemous and say you can't do anything with a novel unless it is first good reading.
I saw at the heart of the grove orderly mounds of aid bags, of sorghum, rice, powdered milk, beans. Mocha led us down the avenues of these squared-off stockpiles. Each bag boasted discreetly of the generosity of this or that democracy. The bunker of the Eritrean official who minded the food dump was dug profoundly into the ground. We entered it down earth stairs. The heat had pooled unspeakably in there.
Gabriel Mikhail, you always argued that famine and endemic hunger weren't connected simply to climatic events, and I suppose now more than ever you'd argue that.
This year it's true that the climatic conditions have improved, but the crisis is still with us, and this is because of the war, which is the underlying problem or the root cause for the suffering and displacement of a lot of people. This year, as a result of the fighting, the atrocities of the Ethiopian government and the declaration of the state of emergencies, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced. And this displacement took place at the wrong time for the agricultural activities. It took place in the months of May and June, which are the most critical months in the agricultural activities of the people. Consequently, this year we have a deficit. And this deficit is made up partly by the people themselves, and partly it has to be made up from food aid that has to come from the international aid community.
The other war being waged in Africa is the one against women, especially traditional nomadic women, who've always been in a subservient position. They may be promised to someone for marriage when they're only 1 week old, but there are other more directly brutal practices. There's a character in the novel, Lady Julia, who is not concerned with what happens at the front. She's interested in the mutilation and infibulation of women, and she's heard that the Eritreans are making great inroads into this traditional practice. She says that for every time African man kills African man, there are 2 or 3 women who die of complications in adulthood from this childhood injury they've suffered. And likewise, there are 2 or 3 girl children who have died of hemorrhage or septicemia as a result of this primitive procedure. Now, I've asked Judy, as a woman of great sensitivity, to raise this question with some traditional women.
How did Eritrean women traditionally live?
تمام ما نبابرو هاق تنقبني لدنقر عادات دي بعله ولا تعمل تولد أبوها يوم ولدت لبلا ولا ولد يجعلها من المستورات تبقى قلقة.
And could you ask them how the EPLF are dealing with the practice of female circumcision and infibulation?
هذا مسؤولية الهالات بنقولوا الهالات لا كيف والشفت اللي هو الشعبية.
كازا من جف الشعبية مصد اللي كشبه مدرتكم بتو قليل قويا لشعب كمان أمرنا مدرته لكن بدير صبت على اللي شفتت يترفتي. نا إذا من قبل ولا عند فهمه وعند درسه لكشبه لنا إلا شفتت كم ترف هلا ولا كمان حنا نوسنا أوالد أخشبنا أما سرت قل أمنت قل رأيا أو قل فهمها لأماتنا سلف الأوالدنا أخشبنا وعند رأياهن هي مدرته وصعبين درسياه وفهمياه إلا لا فهمياه كم سولن دوادايا لا شفتت ترفتن حتى قال لي سررته منا مدرته بحكمنا ترى على مدرتنا ولا بقبر كمان وصلنا للرئاه لا رحمان عندي سكين عند بحتك سكزة كمان سلبله لا كأزق عم قبل لنا شفتات اللي تعرف هلا.
I've often written about subjects which have appealed to me as a layman and about which I have a certain layman's knowledge. And I find the research period fascinating and full of rich promise. It provides human contact, and it's a very vital experience. And out of those memories comes some of the impetus for writing, which you do not derive from the writing itself.
We came over a spur of rock to find before us, on a bowl of dust marked out with white lines, 2 teams in full play. Fighting for possession of the soccer ball, they raised dust clouds. The crowd ran to hundreds. All of them were armed. This was the hour when, on other days, the Ethiopian shelling had begun. I wondered what signs had enabled the Eritreans to gauge that this afternoon would be free of bombardment, a suitable day for championship football. The goalkeeper of the Nakfa front was under recurring attack from the Halal forwards. The corner kick came to nothing. Some very clever Halal front defenders took the ball far upfield after there'd been one token attempt at goal by the Nakfa centre forward. It struck me that here, in this bowl between hills, were some hundreds of spectators armed with automatic weapons and with stick and round grenades, and yet none of these arms were fired. None of the grenades flourished or thrown. Players embraced, and the crowd picked up their AK-47s and began to trail back towards their trenches.
During this interminable and savage war, the Eritreans have been fighting the biggest army in Africa, and recently they've inflicted some terrible defeats on the Ethiopians. Mercifully, many of the Ethiopians have surrendered, despite the fear induced in them by their officers that the Eritreans will torture them. The existence of these prisoners is denied by the Ethiopian government.
I had, of course, heard the numbers of Ethiopian POWs quoted, yet I was still taken by surprise by the mere sight of the huge population of prisoners of Sheb. Before us, as we walked in through the narrow neck of a ravine in early morning, the valley was crowded with Ethiopian privates and NCOs. They walked in the open more freely than the Eritreans themselves. I presumed their keepers must have some early warning system against air raid.
Most of these men are conscripts. Most of them, in fact, belong to the Oromo tribe. And many of them are underage and should still be on their farms, helping their fathers, herding the goats, instead of being involved in this distant northern war. One of the characters in the novel is based on a POW, an Ethiopian fighter pilot called Major Petros. Major, it's good to see you again. When you were a pilot, did you believe you were inflicting much harm on the Eritreans and on the rebel cause?
I didn't believe really I was making a lot of damage in the Eritrean fighters, because you can't see what's hidden, camouflaged all over in the valley. You suspect something, but you don't know what it is. As a result, especially as a pilot, you can't say you are inflicting too much, but you might only know that you are hampering their movement.
The cockpit computer brought the pilot exactly to the area. He had dropped out of a sky of African purple and come down over the mountains at a height of a few thousand feet. Dropping further, he could see bunkers neatly slotted into the mountainside. This was the first time in his flying career that he'd sighted the rebels. The bombardment picked up drifts of parched topsoil. Earth was being blended with air. Discs of shrapnel sought out the arms which planted the reforestating tree or the chives bush. The ground seemed full of black shapes into which one did not closely inquire. The earth had been fused to an evil glaze. Even beyond, amongst the trees and brush shelters which had not been burned, boughs had been stripped and lopped, and roofs and walls torn away to show the rudiments of the refugee life. From within could be heard the piercing weeping of a child.
I know you never flew with napalm, but did you become aware after capture of the effects of napalm?
Well, I didn't see by myself, but I'm told but I didn't see by myself.
What about the trauma that you and a lot of other prisoners must suffer of having your existence denied by your own government?
The impact is really terrible. Once fighting for working and fighting for the Ethiopian government, for a government, and all of a sudden you become a prisoner of war and forget it. Nobody recognize the prisoner of war. The outside world, as well as the United Nations, the International Red Cross, has forgotten, and we are just nowhere, in a limbo.
I think what happens with characters is that you meet someone that makes you think you'd like to have an equivalent character in your book. At the start of the book, you may only deviate from the real character by a small compass variation. But as the book progresses, the difference between the real character and the fictional one becomes greater and greater. By the end of the book, they are thousands of miles removed from each other.
The city of Nakfa, wholly in the Eritrean perception as Guernica, Coventry, Jerusalem might be in the perception of others, had, in spite of all its wreckage, the look of one of those places where, given a chance, civilization would pitch. What a polished life Eritrean traders and officials of the Italian Empire must once have lived here. What was left of plaster on the ruined walls of all the town indicated that its color was once golden. Golden schools, yellow rows of shops, a golden mosque whose minaret still stood. A symbol, of course, since it had survived the MiGs. In the late afternoon, the minaret glowed with what you could fancifully call a golden assertiveness against the brown western hills.
Nakfa was as far as I got on my visit here 2 years ago, and every day I was here there was shelling. The front line was just down this road. Since then, the Ethiopians have been driven back towards Asmara in a series of enormous but barely reported battles. There's been a shocking loss of life and a shocking wastage of resources. The Russians sell arms and equipment to the Ethiopians, and the Eritreans have captured large swathes of this material because all of the Eritrean equipment must be captured. What destruction!
Littered, isn't it?
And the men were caught in there,
yes,
generally?
Yes, most of them, they burned with their own hands. They have been burned in here.
How much would you think a truck like that would have cost Ethiopia?
It may cost from 20,000 to 30,000 US$ for such kind of truck.
Fleeing from Nakfa, an entire Ethiopian division was ambushed in this valley by the Eritreans. The Ethiopians sent in their own MiGs to prevent the equipment falling into enemy hands, and in the process they killed many of their own men here. All these trucks, all the armor and equipment here was bought by the poorest nation in Africa, Ethiopia, in its 27-year futile attempt to extinguish the Eritreans. So apart from the death and carnage, this represents lost opportunities for the Ethiopian people, lost hospitals, lost clinics, lost schools. The city of Afarbet was captured by the Eritreans some months past, and you can still smell the conflict in the air. In this particular campaign, the Eritreans captured 2 Russian colonels and a lieutenant. It's been arranged for me to meet with the man who can explain why the Eritreans attacked that Ethiopian aid convoy 2 years ago and enraged Bob Geldof. The man's Esaias Afwerki, the General Secretary of the EPLF. What was the impact of the attack on the food convoys in late 1987.
What interest would we see in attacking a convoy coming through Massawa, arriving at Asmara, and food being distributed to our population in that area? Of course, it's been dramatized, and sensational stories about that event were there, and it was easily manipulated by those who wanted to use the EPLF as a scapegoat for their implicit support of the government using food aid as a political weapon, of the government using food aid and relief convoys as a cover-up for its military movements. Convoys used to cover and transport ammunition and weapons for the government.
And do you say that the Ethiopians are still using food convoys as cover for shipments of armaments?
Now, of course, after 2 years, it's become evident to everyone, and anyone can see that for himself by going and seeing all these relief trucks with their logos being used by the military.
Has the fact that you're holding 3 Russian prisoners had any effect on the behavior of the Russians?
I don't think it has affected the Russian attitude, because people might now talk about perestroika, glasnost changes inside the Soviet Union, but I think the Soviet Union clearly knows what it has been doing in the past 10 years. They have continued to supply the regime with weapons. In fact, they have introduced new weapons in the war.
The war's being waged in trench lines very similar to the horrific trench lines of World War I, except that in Eritrea some of the trenches are at 2,000 meters.
The Eritrean frontline situation has altered extraordinarily since I was last here. The Eritreans had a trench line up in the north near Nakfa, and they've now moved on about 8 hours drive from there, so that they are threatening from both the north and the south the highland town of Keren, which is just over this hill. And as well as that, the nearest point in this trench line to Asmara is only 65 kilometers from that ancient and sacred capital, which is in fact the Jerusalem of the Eritreans.
The Eritrean passion for education extends right up to the front line, where we found soldiers from the support trenches sitting in class.
They pursued, these Eritreans, the ideal of honorable warriorhood. I couldn't quite believe it achievable. And yet the trenches were impeccably maintained, as if intended to be the martial face of the Eritrean educational ferment. From high points, we saw their line snaking to exploit every contour of the ridge. It would be terrible to be sent to take it, to be an Ethiopian child, loaded with your assigned weaponry and kit, arriving out of breath, to face the massed English grammar of the Eritreans.
The rest of the world doesn't seem particularly interested in what happens here unless there's a famine on, which they tend to identify with drought rather than with this horrifying war. It's easy for a visitor to the trenches to, as the Americans say, get off on the warriorhood of the Eritreans, but that's a self-indulgence. When you see those young Ethiopian corpses who have been thrown away in recent offensives, then you realize that for pity's sake, international forces have to settle this business.
Perhaps 20 paces from me, unburied and sun-mummified, Ethiopian corpses lay in shreds of uniform. Again, I dropped back down the parapet, breathless. I felt their terror, the anguish, the scalding loss of breath of stunned conscripts solidified there on the slope, full of hope and desperation and madness, they'd been driven this far uphill from their own trenches. And then the Eritreans had ended their surge.
Darcy is younger and a little prettier than me, but the effect of the journey on him is more or less the same as it was on me. I was astounded by the possibilities of this society where women are given such opportunities, where education is ubiquitous, where there's such planning for the future, where they're training kids in bunkers for the late 20th century computer age. It is an astonishing society of which hardly anyone in the world has heard. It could, in fact, be on another planet in the solar system, for all most people know about it. And therefore, Darcy does feel that he's entering a strangeness, and he feels that he is nearly on the verge of witnessing a moral evolution in mankind, the evolution from a just revolution to a just republic. And this transition is discussed continuously by the soldiers in bunkers just like this. It is an extraordinary sensitivity they have to the perils of a revolution when it becomes a government.
Eritrea was like a carnival park of the moralities. There, the greatest human fantasy, the fantasy of perfectibility, displayed its glittering, supremely complex and supremely simple wheels, and dazed and giddied the spectator.